Okay.
Yeah, so my name is James Anderson. I'm a PhD student at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. I do not have a flow chart. Not everybody in Carbondale does that. If you get a chance to check out Nick's, you like to do that while or instead of listening to my presentation. It's right there. So the title of my presentation is Anarchist-Socialist Praxis and Embodied Human Nature. And so I'll just jump right in. In this talk, I'll consider the claim made by Noam Chomsky that any serious social science or theory of social change must be founded on some concept of human nature. Some chafe at the term human nature for understandable reasons. Selfishness, aggressive competition, hierarchy, authority, domination, and other traits in the prevailing order are chalked up to inevitable aspects of our nature justifying existing social arrangements. Other arrangements are thus dismissed as unnatural and hence not worth trying. Acknowledging human nature, however, can help us think through what arrangements would enable our human being to flourish. But does that being have an essence? So in his thesis on Feuerbach, Marx wrote that the essence of man is the ensemble of these social relations. Antonio Gramsci echoed Marx and claimed the basic innovation introduced by the philosophy of praxis is its demonstration that there is no abstract human nature, and it is really just the totality of historically determined social relations, in short. Human nature, as a complex of social relations, is a theme to which we'll return. But let's first consider other statements from the same writers. In Capital, Marx suggested humans differ from other animals because within every human labor process, a result emerges which had already been conceived by the worker at the beginning, hence already existed ideally. That projection prior to work performance might not be unique to humans, but when Marx claimed labor as such is an eternal natural necessity which mediates the metabolism between man and nature, and therefore human life itself, he suggests something transhistorical about our nature. John Holloway has acknowledged Marx's claim, but submitted in place of labor, concrete doing, then, is an activity that is common to all phases of human existence, but it exists in different forms in different phases. The form capital imposes upon our doing falls under the banner of abstract labor. Labor, Holloway explains, is cruel and dehumanizing, the very opposite of that conscious life activity, which is potentially the basis of our humanity. By performing abstract labor, we weave a web of social relations that appear inseparable from our human nature and thus immutable. We construct a prison for ourselves. Gramsci, who did most of his writing inside an actual prison, has another quote worth pairing with the previous. All men are intellectuals, Gramsci averred, adding, but not all men have in society the function of intellectuals. The quote, etched in his prison notebooks, implies a belief in human nature and faculties shared across the species. Chomsky is the thinker most famous for tying innate human intellectual capacities, acknowledged by both Marx and Gramsci, to some notion of human nature. But his conceptions are not always properly understood. For instance, in Philosophy in the Flesh, the Embodied Mind and its Challenge to Western Thought, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson claimed Chomsky believes there is a single universal human nature, that the mind is separate from and independent of the body, and that what makes us distinctively human is our mental capacities, not our bodies. Interpreting Chomsky's position in a curious way, they continue, since what makes us human is our minds, not our bodies, and since the mind is separate from the body, what makes us essentially human is not material. Thus it follows from this philosophical perspective that universal human nature does not include a need to acquire material possessions beyond what is required to live. Capitalism is thus a perversion of universal human nature. Non-state socialism is in accord with universal human nature. With this interpretation, one arrives at the conclusion Lakoff and Johnson wrote, that the ideal form of government is a type of anarchistic socialism, which they claim is why Chomsky favors anarcho-syndicalism. It's interesting. They claim Chomsky's anarchist-socialist philosophy is derived from the same source as his linguistic philosophy, given evidence of Lakoff's own linguistic research undergirding his politics. Writing in The Nation after the 2004 presidential election, Lakoff, a self-styled framing specialist, implored readers to, quote, immediately convince our leaders to unite behind progressive values. And he wrote, moral values at the national level are idealized family values projected onto the nation. Progressive values are the values of a responsible, nurturant family, where parents, if there are two, are equally responsible. Their job is to nurture their children and raise them to be nurturers of others. Nurturance has two aspects, empathy and responsibility, both for yourself and your children. From this, all progressive values follow, both in the family and in politics. Lakoff literally grafts his metaphorical notion of nurturant parent-family morality onto the nation-state, affirming paternalist and authoritarian values he purports to reject. Perhaps it's no coincidence, then, the way Lakoff responded when students at Berkeley occupied Wheeler Hall in the wake of an announcement about an impending 32% tuition fee increase across the University of California system in 2009. Seizing the microphone on the scene, he said since students knew their actions would result in police violence, they were thus responsible for that violence if they remained. In addition to telling occupiers police had not fired rubber bullets or hurt students outside the building, even though there was, and they did. Lakoff has been wrong before. Lakoff and Johnson misconstrued key aspects of Chomsky's generative grammar, leading to misguided assumptions about his politics and politics generally. Contra their readings of his work, Chomsky contends our finite brains and bodies, or biology if you rather, accounts for our language capacity. If we are biological organisms, not angels, Chomsky contends, then our cognitive faculties are similar to those called physical capacities. This is true whether we comprehend the inner workings of those faculties or not. What Chomsky calls I-language, the internal, individual, and intentional feature of language, is, he states, a biological property of humans, some component of mostly the brain, with the brain understood at a certain level of abstraction. Chomsky thus believes, as do many, that the capacity for language relies on our shared biological endowment, biological characteristics common across the species, but not found in non-human animals. This is why a human infant is capable of making sense out of externalized human language amid a cacophony of noises in the way that no cat or chimpanzee can. Innate structures in large part account for the depth and richness of our possible knowledge, gleaned even with partial data or limited environmental experience. Now, it's fashionable to treat mental aspects of the human organism differently from so-called physical aspects, and Chomsky calls this a kind of methodological dualism, which is more pernicious than Cartesian metaphysical dualism. He notes how one commonly reads claims in the literature that universal grammar has been refuted or does not exist. But this must be a misunderstanding. To deny the existence of UG, that is, of a biological endowment underlying the capacity for language, would be to hold that it is a miracle that humans have language and other organisms do not. That is, rejecting a theory of embodied faculties reproduces a mind-body dualism and epitomizes anthropocentric thought. The biological basis for human language acquisition, as Chomsky interprets it, is not wholly independent from either the rest of the bodily organism nor from the body's interaction with the rest of the world. He cites three interrelated factors accounting for human growth and development: the organism's genetic constitution, environmental effects, and laws of nature. The factors get short shrift in strict empiricist doctrines that Chomsky vehemently disagrees with. Empiricists usually admit organs of the body are structured from birth, but they tend to also adhere, at least theoretically, to a dualism regarding the mind-brain as an empty or unstructured organ. That assumes knowledge acquisition forms freely, irrespective of biological maturity, and heedless of the ways nutrition, education, class position, etc. remain crucial in human ontogenetic development, key to realizing our diverse potentials. Our biological conditions and hence needs distinguish us from plants and from many non-human life forms. We'd be quite different beings with different needs if we used photosynthesis to fuel our activities, or if we flew through the sky like vultures. That we do not develop chlorophyll pigments or convert light energy from the sun into chemical energy for our body, nor grow wings, demonstrates our different genetic limitations. But Chomsky is at pains to point out our nature is both constraining and enabling. It is enabling precisely because it is constraining. Without the limits that constitute human nature, Chomsky explains, our cognitive capacities would also have no scope. Just as if the genetic endowment imposed no constraints on growth and development of an organism, it could become only a shapeless, amoeboid creature reflecting accidents of an unanalyzed environment. The conditions that prevent a human embryo from becoming an insect play a critical role in determining that it become human. Our common innate creative capacities, enabling a near infinite array of possible expressions, are made possible by finite means and organismic qualities that distinguish us from amoeboid-like blobs. Chomsky's critique of psychologist B.F. Skinner, circa the early 1970s, illustrates disagreement over other defining features of humanity. Skinner argued at the time science would come to explain why, quote, behavior is indeed related to the antecedent events of which can be shown to be a function. Reducing human behavior to mere environmental reaction, as in Skinner's strict stimulus response behaviorism model, or assuming human beings are born as blank slates, capable of being molded any which way as the model implies, can rationalize authoritarian control and elide the uniqueness of our generative faculties. If people have no intrinsic nature, Chomsky explained about the ideological serviceability for managerial classes of blank slate behaviorism, then there is no moral barrier to control or manipulation of them in their own interest, of course. Chomsky also considers there little reason to doubt the creative character of language, referring to it as typically innovative without bounds, appropriate to circumstances, but not caused by them, a crucial distinction, he explains. Our unbounded creative use of language, enabled by our bounded embodied being, a use irreducible to stimulus response and incapable of being predicted by deterministic mathematical formulas, represents a key aspect of the universal human capacity for freedom. Our shared power for intellectual invention, innovation, and also rational inquiry, essential facets of human nature for Chomsky, is the basis for Gramsci's assertion that all people are intellectuals, even if not everyone has that function in class societies. Gramsci's quote also comports with Chomsky's ideas about human universality, one basis for solidarity. The two key parts to Chomsky's approach then, one, that we have an element of individual autonomy, and two, that the autonomy every human has is a commonality that cuts across the species, come together, I would suggest, to form the foundation of Chomsky and anarchist-socialist philosophy. Each individual is endowed with the ability to determine how human potentials are best realized and can show solidarity with others sharing that ability through this or that form of free association or demonstration of support. Reinforcing individuality and sociality each have to be respected and encouraged for fuller human freedom. Capitalism is able to mutilate and mold individuality and sociality precisely because there is an underlying and historically transcendent human nature. Correspondingly, and not unlike the Marx quote I cited before, David Graeber has argued capitalism is a mode of production that produces not just things, but also people and social relations. But people are not reducible simply to any ensemble of social relations. Chomsky once wrote, "The essence of human nature is human freedom and the consciousness of this freedom." By this he surely means our capacity for creativity and for conscious, reflective, self-determined human doing. As Marx noted, the unfreedom of capital has no basis in natural history, but rather emerged as a result of a past historical development, the product of many economic revolutions, of the extinction of a whole series of older formations of social production. Given that our natural constitution affords us a range of judgments that go far beyond obedient mechanical reaction, we can consider other possibilities in light of history and not just repeat what we did before. In his 1971 debate with Michel Foucault, Chomsky said, if a fundamental element of human nature is the need for creative work, for creative inquiry, for free creation without the arbitrary limiting effect of coercive institutions, then of course it will follow that a decent society should maximize the possibilities for this fundamental human characteristic to be realized, which capitalism currently does not. Of course, he's qualified. Our understanding of the nature of man or the range of viable social forms is so rudimentary that any far-reaching doctrine must be treated with great skepticism, just as skepticism is in order when we hear that human nature or the demands of efficiency or the complexity of modern life requires this or that form of oppression and autocratic rule. Still, it'd be a shame, Chomsky said, to put aside entirely the somewhat more abstract and philosophical task of trying to draw the connections between a concept of human nature that gives full scope to freedom and dignity and creativity and other fundamental human characteristics, and to relate that to some notion of social structure in which those properties could be realized and in which meaningful human life could take place. Foucault, on the other hand, rejected claims about human nature in the debate, citing past state socialist experiments in which paradigms for liberated human nature still relied on the bourgeois model. Foucault argued that in a revolutionary scenario, the proletariat wages war against the ruling class not because it considers it just, but because, as he claimed, quote, it wants to take power, and because it will overthrow the power of the ruling class, it considers such a war to be just. Foucault questioned whether the idea of justice functions merely as an instrument of political economic power and as a weapon against that power. Chomsky, in turn, argued neither our bodies nor our notions of justice can be reduced to socially constructed discourses or power plays. Humans are not infinitely malleable. Institutions, prisons, for example, can indeed be dehumanizing. Our humanity doesn't easily adapt to the horrors of incarceration. As organisms, we have scopes and limits. We can talk of something being dehumanizing or unjust when it unnecessarily impedes on our scopes or when force is used to impinge upon our biological limits. A concept of justice is meaningful insofar as it refers to relations that respect and nourish our limits and scopes, our nature. Chomsky's naturalism provides a normative, if never fixed or precisely definable, ideal of human flourishing. In chic relativist theories, human bodies are not generally considered sites of creativity or autonomy, but rather products of discourses or elements of language acts in a vortex of power that totally defines and subsumes us. Chomsky's naturalism instead holds that our natural constitution endows us with ethics and rationality capable of discerning the way power and ideology function. The belief informs Chomsky's understanding of a key tenet of the rich and varied anarchist tradition. That is, anarchism entails identifying structures of hierarchy, authority, domination, and control, determining if those structures are at all justified, and if not, which is usually the case, dismantling them while prefiguring more just forms of organization. Chomsky's philosophy helps increase our awareness of relations of hierarchy and domination, and of our reasons for opposing those relations, given the likelihood that they impede maximization of human potentials. But for a robust appreciation of the potentials that lie latent, we need additional dialectical insights, largely absent from Chomsky's approach. For this, I turn to the work of Murray Bookchin, who advanced a social ecology which understands the social is, potentially at least, a fulfillment of the latent dimension of freedom in nature. Bookchin took dialectics to be a mode of thought that distinguishes phases of the evolutionary continuum from which second nature, human society, and culture emerges, while first nature is preserved. His dialectical naturalism held maturity is never so complete that there ceases to be potentiality for further developmental change. Recovery of human nature became a key part of his project. To recover human nature, he wrote, is not only to recover its continuity with the creative process of natural evolution, but to recognize its distinctiveness. Instead of subsuming society within nature or vice versa, social ecology tries to recover the distinctive attributes of both in a continuum that gives rise to a substantive ethics, wedding the social to the ecological without denying the integrity of each. Bookchin's dialectics acts as an antidote to the ironically inorganic and surprisingly shallow anti-humanist currents of deep ecological thought. Anti-humanism, within deep ecology, currents of it anyway, hypothesizes nature, reproducing a dualism between human second nature and non-human first nature, in contrast to the dialectical naturalism of social ecology, which acknowledges the emergence of the former out of the latter. Anti-humanism deprecates nature by taking our human attributes, like the ability to reason, to anticipate, to act insightfully, to enhance our own natural development, and separating those qualities from nature as though they did not emerge out of evolutionary development and were not implicitly part of animal development. Fashionable misanthropy sometimes casts humanity as a cursed parasite or virus, but this anti-humanism is insidiously anti-ecological because it obscures the connection between human second nature and non-human first nature, again reproducing a dualism where a dialectic is needed. Humans have demonstrated immensely destructive powers that probably surpass those of all other life forms on this planet. Beetles have not dropped atomic bombs. Bonobos do not contribute to anthropogenic climate disruption, as we do. Denying human nature dangerously downplays our distinctive role in causing planetary harm. But blanket human hating is equally fatalistic. Misanthropic flames deflect interrogation of the social and economic origins of ecological problems. As Bookchin noted, how long one can continue to belabor humanity for its affronts to the biosphere without distinguishing between rich and poor, men and women, whites and peoples of color, exploiters and exploited is a nagging problem that many ecological philosophers have yet to resolve or perhaps even recognize. His naturalistic dialectic differs. It recollects ethical responsibilities associated with our distinctive human nature. A range of conceptualization and ethical rationality diverges appreciably from what is found in non-human life forms. Other organic bodies we wouldn't hold to the same moral standards for obvious reasons. Bookchin notes rights come from the human social sphere, and it's a keen observation. Leopards claim no rights for themselves, Bookchin argued, and certainly recognize no right to life, much less to self-realization in the animals in which they prey. Ascribing rights to non-human animals, like say leopards, is anthropocentric and unfair to them. The range of conceptualization and possible ethical rationality exhibited by leopards, bonobos, beetles, and bloodhounds are markedly different from ours. And so we wouldn't chastise a leopard for killing in the wild, as we would probably be critical of humans for murdering other people, nor would we probably accuse a bloodhound of rape, since that's a way of referring to an act of bodily violation we primarily reserve for denouncing what only humans have done. Dialectical naturalism distinguishes human nature from the rest of nature in describing us as distinctive moral agents that can be held responsible by other moral agents to not do harm. Our moral agency helps explain why we are compelled to practice transformative justice when harm is committed. Bookchin became equally critical of anthropomorphist assumptions that cropped up even in the biocentric canons attempting to overcome humanocentric thought. When biocentric ideology imputes distinctly human attributes onto non-human nature, it duplicates a concealed and deeply problematic anthropomorphism. On the first page of The Ecology of Freedom, The Emergence and Dissolution of Hierarchy, Bookchin claimed his views could be summarized in a fairly crisp formulation. The very notion of the domination of nature by man stems from the very real domination of human by human. Put differently, domination is a distinctly human relation. We might despoil the natural world, but we cannot dominate it because domination, like exploitation, implies a human relationship and human ethical capacities capable of identifying domination and determining it to be unjust. Likewise, Bookchin repudiates mystical appeals to any oneness wherein humanity dissolves ideologically into everything else, ignoring our naturally endowed difference. If we are simply one with the world, dissolved into it without distinction, moral agency disappears. If we assume our moral agency does not exist, Bookchin explained, then human beings can proceed to use the biosphere exclusively to suit their own ends, a right that can't be denied any more than leopard's right to kill and feast on its prey. An obvious objection might insist such actions will ultimately boomerang on us, destroying the possibility of human life on the planet. But that sort of thinking reaffirms the aforementioned sinister dualism between first and second nature at best, or supports an instrumental rationality that conceives of the world as consisting of parts to be used for one's own gain at worst. Bookchin calls the latter a crassly instrumental utilitarian assumption, since it suggests our concern for nature rests solely on our own self-interest. Granted, even Chomsky has criticized the human degradation of nature on the basis that our destruction of ecology undermines the meaningful human survival, wiping out the possibility of decent life for our grandchildren. Perhaps that concern for human posterity is not so easily reducible to instrumental reason. Regardless, a humanity rendered oblivious, in Bookchin's words, to our own species' distinctiveness risks conforming to the institutional demands of the hierarchical and exploitative social systems of a mutilated second nature, driving instrumental treatment of the natural world, human bodies included. But any dialectical naturalism, attuned to our innate creative and caring capacities, needs to also recognize our ontological incompleteness. Nature's human embodiment bestows upon us the ability for self-realization through theory and action praxis. We are constituted to be able to identify and actualize the potential for our self-determined human being by altering our social relations to expand self-conscious ecological awareness and maybe the realm of freedom. Thanks.